Hello, I'm Anawiltos, and today I'm going to talk to you about technological ethics. And when I say technological ethics, you can think about it in a couple of different ways. One is the idea of ethics relating to newly emerging technologies. That is, for example, the ethics of new weapons, new drugs, new medical procedures, human cloning, human genetic modification, and such things. Or you can think of it and the way I'm going to discuss today is the ethics of existing moral precepts as being modified by new technological developments. For example, in the question of abortion, there's the idea, for example, and recently Texas put forward a law that abortion should not be performed before it should not be performed after a heartbeat is detected in the child. So, in that sense, this puts forward an idea that it is wrong to do abortion after that point. Now, that being said, you might say, well, maybe they're not actually saying that it's wrong. Maybe it's for some other political reason. But if you were to talk about the legislators of Texas and if you were to talk about talk to the pro-life crowd and anti-abortion people, and I will say that those two aren't necessarily the same, you will find that for most of these people, this is actually a very important moral issue. So I think it's pretty fair to say that the reason why such a law passed is due to moral concerns on the part of either the legislatures or the people lobbying for such legislation. Now, that being said, therefore, the question then becomes, is this a principle that could be applied to other times? Now, we're making an assumption here, and that is that this is a moral precept in itself and not a compromise. And admit it probably is a compromise. But if somebody were to say that abortion is only allowable before a heartbeat is detected, and if somebody were to take that as a moral position, then what does that mean actually historically? Because a lot of people think about the impact of morals in the present and on the future, but I think one thing that's very important to look at is how does our current understanding of morals impact how we look at the past? Because I think that this is something that a lot of people miss out on, because a lot of people live in a society and there are certain morals in a society, and you might have your own religion or worldview or life stance, as some people say, on why certain things are right or wrong. So you have your own ethicists, or you might be an ethicist yourself, and you might have all these ideas on why things are right and wrong, but your default view, based on social interactions, might actually modify how you view the ethicists in this. So, in the case of abortion, if you were to go to the past and ask, let's say, medieval people to follow this as a moral standard, they would have a lot of trouble. Why? Because they don't really have the technology to detect when exactly the heartbeat starts. So this is something that if you were to go back into the past, or perhaps let's say you go into the future and and there's some sort of collapse and you don't have either the infrastructure or you're in a remote place or just technology in general goes down the toilet and you don't have the ability to follow this as a moral precept, then the moral precept in essence collapses. Because in the Middle Ages, they have no way of telling that. The earliest they could tell is in the phase that people would call the quickening, when the baby starts moving, but that's obviously much later than when the heart actually starts beating. And so they might actually unwittingly be a lot more permissive based on that standard than people using that standard today might actually use. Now, of course, the idea of abortion only being allowed before the quickening isn't a universal idea historically. For example, early versions of the Hippocratic Oath ban abortion, and they don't really make a distinction on when, at what point in the pregnancy abortion is banned. So you would assume that it just means in general, and therefore throughout the whole pregnancy. So the original Hippocratic Oath is actually, you could say, pro-life. Although once again, I use the term pro-life as an asterisk because it doesn't necessarily mean everything that's anti-abortion. So I suppose anti-abortion might be a better perspective on this. But let's say a concrete example where people making a moral argument today could be very different from the type of argument people were making in the past. And that is, let's say, incest. So with incest, you have a situation where if you were to ask people today, why is incest wrong? The common answer you would get is because it can lead to genetic defects. But if you go back into the past and you ask an ancient person, the answer might be a bit different, because some people might have this idea because there's inbred people throughout history. There's inbred people today, inbred people in the Middle Ages, inbred people in antiquity, different continents, and they might see an inbred person, and some people that are inbred actually turn out fine. Some people turn out quite horribly, and let's say they look at someone who's turned out quite horribly, and they know that there was incest. And what would they say about that? Well, they could say that the inbreeding is the direct cause of their deformation, and therefore they could take a naturalistic approach there, or they could also take a supernatural approach and say that the deformation is a divine punishment for the incest of the parents. And you wouldn't really be able to prove which one is true because you don't have the technology to prove which one is true in those times. And this, therefore, puts forward an interesting question. Why is it that people originally believed that incest was wrong? And the most common answer, or at least the answer you get from the Christians, is because it displeased God. God called it an abomination, and therefore he banned it, and he described all different types of incest that he was banning. And so under this understanding, this puts an interesting idea that while we can say that there's a medical reason that incest can be damaging, we can also say that this isn't actually explicitly linked as a motivation, at least in Christian culture, as to why incest is banned. Now, a lot of people can make the assumption that this is what it's actually talking about. But if you take that position, let's say you take the position that the reason it's wrong is because it causes physical problems, and you take that as the sole position, then the question becomes, well, what about step siblings? Or what about adopted siblings? Or what about people that have been genetically modified so that they don't have genetic defects and they're biological siblings? Then what do? Then you have incest, and under the naturalistic principle that it's only wrong if it causes a genetic defect, then that wouldn't be wrong. But if you were to ask any Christian, it would still be wrong because that's not really the basis. So if a Christian comes to you and tells you that incest is wrong purely because of the negative effects that it has, they are not being consistent with their theological source of understanding. So in that sense, what I mean is that the principle of incest being wrong is a principle that in Christianity is not really based on its adverse effects. Not even the biological effects. not even the social effects of it. It's purely based on what you could call a divine command theory, because that's explicitly what is stated. And you can talk about implicit ideas and all those other things, but all those other things are secondary to what is explicit. So, in that sense, therefore, if a Christian were to say that incest is wrong because of the bad effects that it has, the person would ultimately be in disagreement with his theological predecessors, because this is something that was not always knowable, whether the cause of these bad mutations is is biological, or whether it's supernatural, or also the idea that there are likely cases where people didn't have major defects, and there could be cases in the future where people won't have these defects, or where the causes of these defects are mediated and dealt with from a technological perspective. And that's where the technology comes in, because the technology is what allows us to understand the genetics and the problems there. But it also, in the future, could give us a solution to those problems. So then the question is it still wrong? And that gets to the point here on whether someone has an ethics that is timeless, that is an ethics that doesn't really care about the technological state, or whether something is directly harmful or not, or an ethics that is adaptable or progressive. For example, there's different views on homosexuality, where there's the Christian perspective is that it's a moral evil. Then there's a common perspective that people had throughout much of the 20th century, that it's a mental illness. And then there's people that say that it's both. And then obviously nowadays the mainstream perspective is actually split, because there's still different perspectives on it. Some people say that it's a choice. Some people say that you don't have a choice. Some people say that it's genetic. And then if it is genetic, hypothetically speaking, then the question becomes, what about genetics? Because that brings in the question of scientific racism and of looking at people's genes and seeing, is this person predisposed to certain crimes? And if they are you going to take action, or are you going to take a more traditional approach and wait until someone actually tries to commit a crime in order to take action? And an even different approach, what if you then decide, what we can use genetic modification to simply remove people's ability to commit crime? Now, I'm not saying that this is necessarily something that is possible. Let me be very clear on that. I think that all people are predisposed to commit some kind of crime. That is to say, not that they will, but that all people have a tendency to do bad things now and then. And therefore, I think it's a bit silly to single out certain groups of people for this. But that being said, this is a serious question people have to deal with if they consider their ethics to not be timeless, if they consider their ethics to be based on things that are new developments, things that can change. Because some perspectives on race, for example, were popular and mainstream some decades ago, but nowadays people have different perspectives. The scientific racists of the 1920s are very different from the scientific racists of the 2020s. So both in their ideas and their motivations. So in that sense, the question becomes, is technological advancement and scientific theories, are these things going to change your outlook on morality, or is your morality based on something beyond this, something that does not change over time? And within Christianity, and I am a Christian, so I'll talk about this a bit. this is actually a serious, contentious issue because you have the very conservative Christians that might believe in divine command theory. Some of them believe in natural law, although I'm personally very heavily critical of natural law. But then you also have the liberal Christians who believe in progressive values. Some of them might believe in process theology, the idea that God can change over time and that there's new moral revelations, that things can be discovered in the future to have been immoral in the past. And I would say that, and another element of this is people saying you can't judge people of the past with the moral standards of today. But the real question I have is, why not? Not in the sense that we have a different moral standard, but what if the moral standard is objective and therefore the past, the present, and the future all have the same moral standard, and therefore judging people in the past on a moral standard should be possible, and therefore also judging people in the present and on the future on a moral standard, and that therefore technological developments in between actually are quite irrelevant because they don't really have an impact on this moral standard. So I suppose that is a difference between the conservative and progressive position on these issues. So tell me what you think. Do you think that morals, that ethics are things that are objective and unchanging, or do you think that they are things that develop over time, that there's new moral learnings, new moral understandings, or that perhaps we should even condemn the entirety of the previous ethical frameworks of the past and embrace a new progressive understanding of the future? So tell me what you think in the comments section below, and thank you all for watching. I've been Anawiltus, over and out.